Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I'm the Chair of Research in the Postdoctoral Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow at the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker and my dear friend, Dr. Fiona Cunningham. Fiona Cunningham is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests lie at the intersections of technology and conflict with a focus on China. Fiona's first book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security, which is recently published with Princeton University Press, examines China's distinctive approach to the dilemma of coercing an adversary under the shadow of nuclear war, which relies on substitutes for nuclear threats. Her research has also been published in International Security, Security Studies, the Texas National Security Review, and the Washington Quarterly. Fiona's held fellowships at Renmin University of China and Beijing, Harvard, Stanford, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Cunningham's talk today will introduce her new book. While other nuclear-armed countries have preferred the traditional options of threatening to use nuclear weapons or fielding capabilities for decisive conventional military victories, China has instead chosen to rely on information age weapons, offensive cyber capabilities, counter-space capabilities, and precision conventional missiles to coerce its adversaries. Dr. Cunningham explains this distinctive aspect of China's post-Cold War deterrence strategy using an original theory of strategic substitution. When crises with adversaries create these leverage deficits that highlight the inadequacy of China's existing military capabilities, China pursues information age weapons that promise to provide coercive leverage against adversaries more quickly and credibly than the traditional options that have otherwise been adopted by nuclear-armed states. And she draws on hundreds of original Chinese language sources and interviews with experts in China to provide these new insights into the information age technologies that are reshaping how states gain coercive leverage. So we're really excited for this conversation today. It's very timely and I think going to be really salient for this lab community. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Fiona will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll start the Q&A. During this talk, please feel free to start getting your questions ready, and you can raise your hands electronically or type questions into the chat while she is speaking. Thank you so much, Fiona, for joining us today, and over to you.
Super. All right. Well, I will share my screen because I have some slides for some visual aids while I'm speaking. But I want to, first of all, give a very warm thank you to my dear friend Rupal for hosting me, and also to Mariah and to Katie Thomas for their help to make this event happen. And it is my absolute pleasure to talk about my book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security, which was published the first week of this year. And if you're interested after this talk in purchasing a copy, you can do so either from the Princeton University Press website or from Amazon. And I wanted to say just before I actually dive into the talk that it's a particular pleasure to give a book talk about this topic at this lab, because members of the lab community, in particular CGSR, have generously provided feedback on this project while it was still a work in progress, and here is the finished product. The issue at the heart of the book is how nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities and weapons with strategic effects end up interacting. And I appreciate that CGSR has been at the cutting edge of thinking about this problem, both from the perspective of the United States, but also understanding how RED is answering this question. And so, as I'll argue in this talk, how a state approaches this interaction is going to depend quite heavily on whether they prioritize nuclear or conventional forces or neither to gain coercive leverage against their adversaries. So for the next 35 minutes or so, I'll take some time to give you a sense of what the book is about and hopefully why you might find it useful to read it too. First, I'll tell you about the research question or the dilemma that drives the book. I'll then touch on two of the core ideas in the book, strategic substitution and information age weapons. I'll briefly explain my theory of strategic substitution, give you a sense of the cases and the sources that I use to make my arguments, and then I will share some highlights from the chapters on China's decision-making about its nuclear precision conventional missile, offensive cyber operations, and counter space capabilities decision-making, both about to pursue these capabilities and how it's chosen to posture them. I'll conclude with an evaluation of how China's distinctive approach to strategic substitution is faring now that it has been sort of working on this set of capabilities for a quarter century. And I'll look ahead at the future approach of how China's approach to strategic deterrence might evolve, having better conventional and nuclear capabilities than it did a couple of decades ago, and conclude with some policy implications as well. Okay, so without further ado, this book is about how states cope with the dilemma that the nuclear age has created for them if they want to continue to use military capabilities to coerce nuclear-armed adversaries. So how can they do that without triggering a catastrophic nuclear war? And specifically in the case of China, how can they gain coercive leverage if they haven't done what most other nuclear-armed adversaries have done to cope with this limited war dilemma? Most states have either done what the United States has in the post-Cold War era, which is to rely on conventional military capabilities that can achieve a decisive victory against an adversary, or is represented by the missile and the silo in the center of my slide, like Pakistan or Russia, who rely on threats of nuclear first use primarily. China hasn't taken either approach, which generated a lot of suspicion that China had a secret first use nuclear policy. And that was so, I think, even in the early 2000s, long before China's current nuclear modernization commenced and gave it capabilities to actually make those threats more credibly. I argue, though, in the book that China has taken a third approach, which I call strategic substitution, represented with the image of what was not obviously a malicious power outage over Manhattan, but nevertheless gives you a sense of what might be the kind of solutions that China has been thinking through. So what is strategic substitution? At its most simplest terms, it involves threatening to use non-nuclear weapons that can have strategic effects and pairing those threats together with a nuclear posture that threatens retaliation only in the event of a nuclear attack. What is often, I think, called in the nuclear strategy literature an assured retaliation strategy. And what this combination allows a state to do is to increase the risk of escalation, including up to and over the nuclear threshold, but without actually having to make nuclear threats. Rather, what strategic substitution is attempting to do is to dare an adversary to be the one to cross the threshold of using nuclear weapons first. And so, as such, this approach offers or promises to be a substitute for the two more traditional options of gaining leverage that I outlined on the previous slide of threatening nuclear first use or threatening a decisive conventional victory. But I do want to emphasize what strategic substitution is not, because my claim about what is actually being substituted is quite narrow and quite precise. So strategic substitution does not mean a country only uses its information age weapons for coercive leverage. It could also aim to use them or plan to use them to enhance conventional military operations for warfighting, provided that if there are any clashes in how it would have to posture its weapons for one role or the other, it's going to prioritize their coercive functions. The second thing that strategic substitution does not preclude is a country building up its conventional and nuclear capabilities that would enable it to select these more traditional options for dealing with the limited war dilemma in the future. So why did China decide to gamble on this unproven answer to the limited war dilemma? In the book, I argue that there are really two reasons why China made the choice to strike out and do something that other countries hadn't done. The first is that the capabilities China developed during the Cold War to deal with its strategic problems did not thumb the scales in favor of either the nuclear option or the conventional military option when it first faced this limited war dilemma in the mid-1990s. The second reason is that every time China went to augment or increase the coercive leverage that it currently possessed, It prioritized capabilities that were going to give it leverage quickly and credibly. And those two priorities, as I will explain 2 slides from now, favor information age weapons over the more traditional options. So by this point, you might be wondering, what are information age weapons? This term I've been using. This another refers to, I think, my shorthand for precision conventional missiles relying on information networks for guidance, as well as counter space and offensive cyber capabilities that disrupt an adversary's ability to use its satellites or computer networks, respectively. And a second key idea in the book is that these information age weapons can be used to implement strategic substitution because they can promise to provide states with coercive leverage. So what any answer to the limited war dilemma has to do is to give states bargaining leverage, the ability to impose costs or threaten risks against an adversary in ways that are going to force it to recalibrate its decision-making to take into account those costs and risks. And information age weapons look promising for this role because some, but not all of these information age weapons, when they're used in an offensive capacity, share 3 features that enable them to threaten escalation and have strategic effects. The first is that they have large-scale damaging effects on an adversary's military, society, or allies that can be quite challenging to defend against. The second thing is that they cross salient thresholds in limited wars, which are wars in which there are limits to the intensity, the geographical scope, or the number of parties that are involved in the violence. And finally, the use of these weapons can increase the risk of nuclear war because each of these weapons either can be used to deliver nuclear weapons in the case of precision conventional missiles, or alternatively, they can be used to attack an adversary's nuclear arsenal and supporting capabilities in the case of counter space and offensive cyber operations. So together, these 3 features of information age weapons enable states to use them to threaten escalation without actually using or threatening to use their nuclear weapons. But I think it's important to highlight these information age weapons don't create these risks just on their own. They need to be postured explicitly to generate these escalation risks. And I argue in the book that states can either dial up those risks by using what I call a brinkmanship posture that really tries to stoke and increase the autonomous risk of escalation, using these capabilities that escalation process gets out of control or out of the hands of top decision makers. Or alternatively, they can dial down those escalation risks by adopting what I call a calibrated escalation posture, which tries to use these weapons to generate more controlled, incremental escalation risks that look more like ascending rungs of a ladder than descending a slippery slope. So this strategic substitution idea of coping with a limited war dilemma might sound brilliant to some of you and terrible to others. And I think the reality is that strategic substitution is not a silver bullet. It has pros and cons, just like the traditional options of nuclear first use or conventional decisive victories. So what led China, or would lead any state, in fact, to prefer this option over others? In this book, I develop a theory of strategic substitution to kind of explain that process. The theory has 3 basic components: a leverage deficit, in the political science parlance, that is the independent variable. That leverage deficit initiates a search for coercive leverage, which is the kind of key process or mechanism in the theory. And that process results in a state making a decision to pursue an information age weapon. Leverage deficits emerge when a state's threat environment changes, for example, because there's a crisis or a conflict with a key adversary. And what that change in a state's threat environment does is to reveal a problem, that states' existing military capabilities are not going to be adequate for the kind of war or the kind of adversary that it is most likely to fight in the future. And states tend not to ignore these leverage deficits because if they do, should there be a crisis or a conflict in the future, they're either going to have to fight a war that they're likely to lose, or alternatively, they are going to have to make humiliating diplomatic concessions and not choose to contest the crisis. When searching, though, for additional leverage to address these leverage deficits, different priorities lead states down different pathways. And I argue that China differed from its nuclear peers in heading to the substitute answer to dealing with this leverage deficit, rather than the grayed out categories of nuclear first use or conventional buildup that you can see in the center of the slide. And so what's happening in this gray section of the chart is that some states are particularly sensitive to the disadvantages of conventional decisive victory as an option for dealing with the limited war dilemma. And that might be because they lack the resources to ever be able to catch up with an adversary in the conventional domain. Alternatively, they might see disadvantages of going down the option of threatening nuclear first use, perhaps because they are concerned about the prospect of exacerbating a security dilemma if they change their nuclear posture. There are, of course, other disadvantages to these options, and China was sensitive to the disadvantages of both the nuclear as well as the conventional options. On the one hand, it was conventionally inferior to the US, and was going to take China decades in the early 1990s to correct that conventional balance and overtake the US in a way that would enable it to threaten a decisive victory. But its leaders also doubted that it would be credible if China threatened to use nuclear weapons first against a nuclear-armed adversary. So given these sensitivities, information age weapons become appealing substitutes because their advantages are the precise opposite of these conventional and nuclear options. You can acquire information age weapons for coercive leverage faster than correcting the conventional military balance, and threatening to use them is going to be more credible than threatening nuclear use because their effects are simply more destructive and often even more less destructive. Their effects are less destructive than nuclear weapons and sometimes also less destructive even than a large-scale conventional war. So after a state makes a decision that it's going to pursue an information age weapon, to successfully complete their pursuit of strategic substitution, they have to adopt a coercive force posture for those weapons. In the book, I don't actually develop a theory that explains why they pick the slippery slope or the latter, but I do point to some factors that my evidence from China suggests are going to shape these posture choices. They include things like civil-military relations, because a calibrated escalation posture enables decision makers to have a much tighter control on how their most destructive information age weapons are used. The availability of more sophisticated technology is necessary, again, to implement a calibrated escalation posture. Gaining more experience with the technology over time can also influence the choices that states make. And finally, I think in the realm of counter-space weapons and offensive cyber operations, a state's vulnerability to in-kind attacks can also influence how willing they are to generate uncontrolled versus controlled risks in the use of these weapons. So I test the theory of strategic substitution using comparative case studies of all of the substitutes that China has pursued since it began to face the limited war dilemma in 1995. And why does that matter? If you look in the third column of the table in front of you, first line there, the Taiwan Strait crisis. So that crisis that year confirmed to China's leaders that they were going to need to prepare to fight a limited war on their periphery in which a nuclear power with the most advanced conventional and nuclear capabilities was likely to intervene. And I think before that point, there's evidence that there was actually some ambiguity in China as to whether or not the US would actually come to Taiwan's assistance if a cross-strait war ended up occurring. That crisis confronted China with a severe leverage deficit, and China then faced a second leverage deficit, if you continue to go down that column, in 1999, when the US accidentally bombed its embassy in Belgrade. And to this day, China's leaders reject the idea that this was an accident and view it as an intentional action. But my analysis in each of the chapters actually begins long before the year of pursuit that's listed on the slide. And I do that for two reasons. First is to demonstrate that prior to 1995 or the early 2000s, China's decision makers didn't face leverage deficits that we would expect them to go ahead and pursue these information age weapons afterwards. but it also allows me to demonstrate that China often had the technological capability to pursue these information age weapons long before it actually made the decision to choose them. So demonstrating that it wasn't just the availability of technological capabilities that drove China's decision making in these with regards to these weapons. Moving on to the fourth column on the table there of posture choices, I look at how each of China planned to use each of these capabilities. So looking at the capabilities it developed, the organizations, the doctrine, and how much it revealed about these capabilities to adversaries. Since an important part of my argument is to demonstrate that China primarily pursued and postured these capabilities for coercion, rather than primarily pursuing them to augment its conventional military capabilities. The final kind of component of the research design is pairing each of these information age weapons with a kind of shadow case that had similar military effects and could, in some plausible universe, have been used for coercive leverage. And these shadow cases of bomber aircraft, electronic warfare, and SOF provide a point of comparison for what it looks like when China pursues a capability for warfighting rather than for coercion, but also highlight some of the key factors that led China to pick certain capabilities but not others as its key substitutes, like the availability of technology. In the case of bombers, this option was simply not on the table for China in the mid-1990s because it was so weak in aircraft technology. The book draws on what I think are a very unique set of sources to provide commensurately unique insights into China's decision-making. And I acquired many of these sources in Beijing and other cities in China during field work before the pandemic. So I looked at hundreds of Chinese language sources, like chronologies of military and political leaders' lives, the 3 volumes you see up on the slide, the chronology of former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, Liu Huaqing, research publications of the PLA, and biographies of decision makers like Zhu Guanya, who was a really important nuclear scientist and defense industry decision maker, whom I will quote from in the following slides. I also conducted interviews with more than 50 Chinese experts, some of them I interviewed more than once, to inform my theoretical claims about information age weapons and also to provide some context to my empirical analysis. So I'll now get to some highlights from the empirical chapters to show you what I have found and what's presented in some of the chapters of the book. So the first chapter empirically of the book establishes the 2 constraints that China faced on its search for coercive leverage. One, it was conventionally inferior to the United States, and that's pretty uncontroversial in the late 90s and early 2000s, both among Chinese decision makers and US experts. And secondly, the other constraint was that its leaders judged that threatening nuclear weapons first use, was not going to be credible to an adversary. And that chapter investigates 3 instances in which China debated its nuclear policy, 2 which occurred concurrently with leverage deficits China faced in 1995 and after 1999 with that Belgrade embassy bombing, and 1 debate that occurred actually before the period in which China faced the limited war dilemma as the Cold War was ending, when China's strategists were really grappling with how are they going to define the role of nuclear capabilities in an age in which they'd be fighting high technology limited wars. And parts of that first debate as the Cold War was ending and moving into the post-Cold War era are actually quite well documented in the existing literature. And I point here to a landmark article by Harvard professor Alistair Ian Johnson, who documented advocacy in the People's Liberation Army of a limited deterrence posture that, among other things, would have China build a larger nuclear arsenal and include tactical nuclear weapons in its force structure. But more recent sources I've been able to analyze show that during the course of that discussion about limited deterrence, there was an even more extreme position on the other side, which is that China's top leaders also considered whether it was possible nuclear weapons were simply going to become obsolete as they watched US-Soviet nuclear arms reductions. In the end, though, the case for continuity in China's nuclear posture won out in the early 90s, and the quote up on the slide is a recollection of Tian Xiaojun, a former commander of China's nuclear test base. And he's there describing the views of defense decision maker Zhu Guangya, who at the time had oversight over both China's nuclear weapons design as well as its nuclear testing base. And so Director Guangya pointed out basically that the main principles of China's existing nuclear strategy of assured retaliation were still suitable for the objective reality of the post-Cold War world, and it was inadvisable to change them. China again faced a leverage deficit following the Belgrade embassy bombing. A third debate about changing nuclear strategy emerged. And for those of you who may be familiar with the science of second artillery campaigns, a text that ended up leaking into US university libraries, you might be familiar with it for its description of nuclear deterrent signaling that sort of hinted that it was pushing in the direction of chipping away at China's long-standing pledge of nuclear no first use. In the context of that debate, though, in 2002, Jiang Zemin gave a speech indicating that China's leaders, rather than adopting changes to its no first use strategy, were going to diversify its strategic deterrent to address the leverage deficit prompted by the Belgrade embassy bombing. And that was going to include counterspace and offensive cyber operations, the two capabilities China pursued after that Belgrade embassy bombing, alongside a more robust conventional missile force. So he talks about this strategic deterrent system bringing together many means. So China's first information aid weapon that it pursued in the midst of the Taiwan Strait crisis in December 1995 was a missile force that was going to be able to hold at risk targets in Taiwan, as well as eventually US forces in the region as well. When the US issued a visa to Taiwan's president, Lee Teng-hui, in 1995, China protested with missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. And subsequent to that and after action discussions, PLA leaders assessed that these tests were effective in deterring further move toward independence by Taiwan. And they made a decision to build up the coercive missile force to make it longer range, larger, and also more precise. But I think there is also a really interesting story as to how China actually had these conventional missiles to launch and experiment with in the crisis in the first place. And organizational interests of the Second Artillery, China's then nuclear-only missile force at the turn of the Cold War, play a big part in that story. So in the late 1980s, the United States pressured China to cancel sales of short-range conventional missiles to the Middle East. And China's Second Artillery, then a nuclear-only missile force, seized on the opportunity to say, well, maybe we could use those missiles, and in doing so found a role for themselves in a limited war that would be unlikely to go nuclear. And you can see on the slide the quote from Missile Base Commander Ge Dongsheng, making clear that it would be a galling shame and a deep humiliation for the rocket force if it didn't have anything to contribute in a Taiwan contingency that didn't end up requiring the use of nuclear weapons. So turning to China's cyber decision-making, China pursued offensive cyber capabilities to gain coercive leverage. After the Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999, it was one of the responses put in place relatively shortly after that, that crisis occurred. And a common PLA judgment around that time was that nuclear deterrence was not credible, but what they called information deterrence that involved cyber attacks against a much more advanced and digitally dependent adversary society, and military would generate a lot of coercive leverage, and it was going to do so for China quickly and cheaply. So a lot of kind of optimism about what this capability could provide for the PLA. Initially, China's cyber force posture was pretty disorganized, somewhat lacking in oversight. And in fact, what's curious about its cyber force posture is this is the only one of China's strategic weapons, both nuclear as well as information age weapons, for which China ever adopted delegated command and control arrangements in which the top leaders might have appeared on paper to have full control of the use of these capabilities. But in practice, it appeared that the lower level commanders would have actually had more control over cyber operations, including those that could have had strategic effects. And one example of this is what we saw back at that time of quite a lot of engagement in industrial espionage, potentially without the knowledge of China's top leaders. This delegated set of command and control arrangements became a problem for China, ensuring that it was only going to receive blowback for cyber attacks that its leaders has authorized. And this became even more of a problem as China became more digitally dependent itself. And then the cost of any blowback, especially if it came in the cyber domain, went up. So China's leaders addressed this problem by changing its force posture from one that dialed up the risks of escalation, that brinkmanship posture, to one that calibrated it. And that process of change began in 2012 and was completed by about 2014 and implemented with the 2015-16 military reforms in part and the standing up of China's strategic support force. The quote on the slide comes from a PLA officer. It was part of a compendium of research papers presented at a 2012 conference at the outset of this process to start changing cyber force posture. And it lays out the kind of stakes of not properly managing and controlling cyber warfare operations. So noting that at best they reveal operational intentions, at worst they start to influence the overall foreign policy and national political situation. So an awareness of what these capabilities could do to China's interests if they weren't properly managed. I opened the book with China's dramatic test of an anti-satellite weapon in 2007, which, if I think back to that time period, was probably one of the reasons I got interested in this topic. And that dramatic ASAT test followed a decision a few years earlier to invest in counter-space weapons for coercive leverage in conventional conflicts. Jiang Zemin's quote on the slide suggests that by late 2002, China had made a decision to pursue the capability to use counter-space weapons for coercion. It's quite unusual, I should say, in any of the PRC documents to see open acknowledgement that China is actually making a decision to pursue these capabilities. They're often referred to more obliquely as for the language on the slide. And I'd also mention that China has not actually acknowledged that it has any offensive cyber operations officially. But unlike other information age weapons, China has always envisaged using its counter-space capabilities for calibrated escalation, so in that more controlled force posture. And it did so before it even had capabilities that could fill in the lower rungs of the escalation ladder, or the organizational structures in place to exercise strict command and control across all of China's space capabilities. PRC sources about counter-space weapons are often the most explicit in their substitution logic. In the early 2000s through the mid-2010s, they often claimed that space deterrence was much more credible than nuclear deterrence because it was flexible, it took aim at military objects, and it does not directly cause loss of life. The image on the slide comes from an article outlining and actually modeling China's concerns about the behavior of US GSAT satellites that approach other satellites to characterize them. And this is one of a couple of recent US space developments that have really generated concern in China. And a lot of the more recent materials that I've reviewed, so published from about 2019 onwards, suggest that China is particularly concerned about developments in the space realm. And so point to other concerns with US developments like the adoption of proliferated satellite constellations, US counter-space capabilities increasing, but also the US's increasing embrace of commercial space to augment its overall national security space capabilities. So China has now been doing strategic substitution for about more than 25 years, in fact, nearly 30 years. So we can step back at this point and say, how has this gamble on an unproven answer to the limited war dilemma fared? Was it a success? Was it a stopgap? Was it a failure? I think the three most serious constraints on the effectiveness of information age weapons coercion for China have been as follows. First is US responses that have been designed to blunt the coercive leverage China has temporarily been able to achieve, such as changes to its satellite constellations, the establishment of US Space Force, but also the US's withdrawal from the INF Treaty to counter what it views as concerns about China's precision conventional missile capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. The second biggest constraint, I think, has been uncertainty about whether these capabilities can actually deliver on the promise and hype that China believed about what they'd be able to do for its coercive capabilities 25 years ago. And I think this is most serious in the cyber domain. On the one hand, there is evidence that US Cyber Command in the last 5 to 10 years has changed their views of what kind of coercive leverage cyber operations can provide, and really now views their strategic effects as occurring from the cumulative effect of lower level cyber operations below the level of armed conflict. In the same vein, the PLA has started to raise questions about whether cyber operations in the course of a conflict used coercively can actually have the sorts of effects that they are seeking, looking in particular at Russia's inability to gain sort of decisive effects in the course of the early weeks of the Ukraine conflict. But then we see, on the other hand, that China appears to be in many ways following the PLA's doctrine about offensive cyber operations to a T when they have been engaging in the Volt Typhoon intrusions into US and allied critical infrastructure to prepare for cyber attacks ostensibly in the event of a crisis. The third major, I think, constraint has been the growing entanglement of China's information age operations and weapons with its nuclear forces. And this means that China's ability to kind of carefully manage escalation risks, keep that very clear threshold between information age weapons use and nuclear weapons use intact. And I think we see this most clearly in the space case, because while the PLA always anticipated that China would have a very large set of space support capabilities for its conventional military operations, 25 to 30 years ago, it was not clear that China would also be building out a satellite early warning system to assist its nuclear forces. So where does that leave us? So China's leaders might see this novel answer to the limited war dilemma as a success to be continued, a stopgap until conventional modernization is completed, or a failure that prompts it to reconsider the nuclear first use option, represented by the three images on the slide. Since I'm sure many of you are actually wondering how strategic substitution squares with China's nuclear modernization, I'll talk about each of these possibilities in conversation with that modernization. The success option would mean that China maintains its assured retaliation nuclear strategy, but it benefits via the modernization from having a stronger nuclear shield to engage in non-nuclear escalation using its information age attacks. The nuclear modernization in this scenario is more likely to be driven by calculations of how much damage China needs to threaten in the nuclear domain against the United States, rather than by the desire to augment China's coercive leverage in conventional conflicts. Second, the stopgap option would envisage that China still expects to achieve conventional capabilities capable of threatening a decisive victory against the US. But even if it achieves that ability to rely primarily on its conventional forces, it's still going to need information age and nuclear weapons to deny an adversary the option of threatening to escalate the conflict to overturn a PLA conventional victory. So a slightly different role if that's where China goes in the future. And finally, the failure option means that China's leaders have either changed their views of the credibility of nuclear threats, and they now have much more confidence they'd be taken seriously by the United States, or alternatively, they've lost confidence in strategic substitution that's going to leave them no better options other than to shift to nuclear first use to ensure that they have some answer to the limited war dilemma. So that is, I think, one of the reasons why carefully assessing whether these information age weapons have delivered on their promise is important for understanding what China's nuclear modernization is all about. So I'll conclude with some implications of the book for policymakers. I think I'll highlight 4 of them. The first is, I think, zooming out. The book highlights how political dynamics, these leverage deficits, are what's driving China's strategic weapons decision making for its information age weapons, rather than things about specific kind of capabilities. And it's therefore perhaps a little bit less surprising that China's leaders and experts continue to yoke the broader political relationship between the US and China to strategic weapons, and especially to nuclear weapons, in response to any of the US demands or entreaties to try and better manage some of the risks in the nuclear weapons relationship. So we can kind of see where they're coming from, given the drivers of their choices in this area. Second, I think it highlights some challenges for US-China risk reduction, especially in the nuclear domain. If one of the aims that the US and China might have is to limit the way that some of these information age weapons can generate escalatory risk and lead to inadvertent nuclear escalation, China is perhaps less likely to want to manage those risks, since this is one of the key ways in which its information age weapons enable the country to gain coercive leverage. On the other hand, though, China's adoption of calibrated escalation force postures that do require signaling something to your adversary about where your red lines are, what's going to lead you to escalate to the next rung on the escalation ladder, are more important. And so this might create opportunities to actually start to have conversations with China about what's going on with some of these non-nuclear capabilities. Third, I think it suggests that any US-China risk reduction framework is going to need to include information age weapons as well. This poses some challenge because it means a whole set of new actors who are not used to having conversations about risk management and stability into the conversation. But it also might create opportunities because the nuclear balance between the US and China is still relatively lopsided, but there is a broad base of mutual vulnerability in the relationship if you expand it and consider information age weapons vulnerabilities as well. Finally, zooming right out, one of the implications of the book is that US allies in the region might also benefit from borrowing from this strategic substitution idea and develop information age weapons to gain their own independent coercive leverage without needing to consider the nuclear weapons option and nuclear proliferation. So I will pause there. If you were interested in my other work, my website is up there on the slide. But similarly, if you're interested in purchasing the book, there is a 30% off coupon with Princeton University Press. And I am really excited for the conversation. So thank you all for listening.